physicalism, as you said, is the thesis that consciousness is just physical process in the brain. And first, are physicalism and materialism the same? And second, I mean, physicalism, as you expressed it, it seems pretty parsimonious. So why is this one insufficient for you as well?
Physicalism, materialism, I guess I tend to use those interchangeably. I perhaps use the word materialism more in my work aimed at a general audience. Maybe the word materialism is a bit more familiar to a general audience, and the word physicalism more in my academic work. Although these days, actually, I tend to just use physicalism. But yeah, I think sometimes people use materialism more for a view rooted in a 16th or 17th century conception of matter, such as Descartes had, or Thomas Hobbes, who was a contemporary of Descartes and a materialist, and maybe physicalism for a conception of the physical world that's rooted more in 20th, 21st century physics. But I just use these words interchangeably. So yeah, what's wrong with it? It's certainly a parsimonious theory, so that's not my problem with it. That is a good point of it. I suppose, I mean, look, what I am most passionate about conveying on this topic is that this is not just a scientific issue, right? We have at the core here a philosophical problem, what has traditionally been known as the mind-body problem, which is just the issue of how consciousness and the physical world connect together, right? So one theory, the physicalist theory, is that physical reality is fundamental and consciousness emerges from physical reality. The panpsychist theory I prefer puts it the other way around, that consciousness is fundamental and physical reality emerges from underlying facts about consciousness. Now, crucially, both of these theories are empirically equivalent, which means that you can't do an experiment. Unlike maybe with dualism in certain forms, you can't do an experiment to distinguish these views, because for any scientific data, each theory just interprets it on their own terms. So this is why this is a philosophical rather than a scientific issue. So how do we decide between them? If it's, people think physicalism is the scientific option and other views are sort of metaphysical speculation. I just dispute that starting point. I think the scientific data is just neutral on all these options. So how do we choose between them? Well, I think we just assess them on their own terms and look at, for example, how well they live up to their explanatory obligations, their explanatory aspirations. So physicalism wants to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes in the brain. Panpsychism, the view I prefer, wants to turn that explanatory task on its head. It wants to start with consciousness and explain physical reality in terms of consciousness. So I just think we have to ask, how plausible are each of these explanatory projects? How well have they gone? I think the physicalist one has never got anywhere, and there are good reasons to think it's not actually a coherent project. Whereas the panpsychist one, I think we've already worked out how to do it. We've solved all the mysteries. It feels a bit culturally weird, but it's, we know how to do it. And so it's just, to my mind, a much more plausible explanatory project than the physicalist one.
Well, I very much want to come back and focus on panpsychism's having solved all of these mysteries, because that's a very strong claim. But I still want to talk a bit about why you think the physicalist program is unsuccessful, in part because, by the time this episode comes out, I will have had a joint episode come out with Steve Pinker, Dennett, and Sean Carroll, where we talk a little bit about this. And I've spoken a lot about physical theories of consciousness on the show, but not panpsychism. So science has a terrific track record with solving problems. And if you talk to somebody like Dan, he will point out that it has been very successful to this point in discovering the neural correlates of consciousness, the so-called NCCs. So I'm wondering why you think that it has been so unsuccessful and why it won't be able to account for consciousness in a satisfactory way.
Good. Just on Steven Pinker, actually, I would say from what I've heard of Steven Pinker and read in his work, he is much closer to my position actually than either Dennett or Sean Carroll. My understanding was that he's some kind of Mysterian view, that is, that there are principled reasons why we just can't understand how consciousness emerges. Maybe there are properties of the brain that we can never get at. I think that's very different to the standard physicalist position that no, we can just explain it in terms of the kind of stuff physical science talks about. And I'm much more sympathetic to that view. I had one of the debates I had that you can get on my website with Rebecca Goldstein, his wife, who has this similar Mysterian view. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Well, it's very important to distinguish the philosophical problem I was just talking about with the science of consciousness. I'm not saying the science of consciousness has not got anywhere. And to my mind, broadly speaking, the difference is that the scientific task is to work out which kinds of brain activity go along with which kinds of conscious experience. As you said, tracking the NCCs, the neural correlates of consciousness. That's a very important scientific task. I mean, it is still a bit of a mess, but I'm hopeful about that project. But I think whatever that project delivers is neutral on the philosophical question. So that the scientific question is which brain activity goes with consciousness. The philosophical question is why? Why does brain activity go along with consciousness at all? Right? And there are these different options, right? Maybe the physical world is first and consciousness pops up. Consciousness is first, the physical world pops up. Or maybe like the dualists, they're both fundamental but radically different. So the scientific data is just neutral on that. But to get straight to your question, your central question, I mean, first, I think that we haven't solved what David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness, the challenge of explaining how electrochemical signaling in the brain could somehow produce an inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes. I would say, not only have we not got the full story, but we haven't really managed to explain a single subjective experience in terms of patterns of neural firing. We've correlated, right? But we haven't got any even the beginnings of an explanation. Okay, but you might say, well, there's just more time. And what I think motivates a lot of people, as you said there, Robinson, is the great track record of science. Maybe we just need more time. Well, what I do in again going back to Galileo's Error and my academic book is to have a slightly different spin on the history of science. I trace the problem of consciousness back to its intellectual foundations in the foundations of on the philosophical foundations of the scientific revolution, in Galileo's decision to put consciousness outside of science in order to allow science to be mathematical. So before Galileo, people thought the world is filled with these qualities, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, and took it, quite rightly in my view, that you can't capture these qualities in the purely quantitative vocabulary of mathematics. So the idea that we could describe everything in mathematics seemed to be absurd, because an equation can't capture that deep red you experience as you watch the setting sun. So this was a challenge for Galileo. Galileo got around it by saying, well, all of these qualities that seem to fill the world, the colors, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, they're not really in the physical world. They're in consciousness, in the soul. That's outside of science. So he strips the world of these qualities so that all that remains can be captured in the purely quantitative language of mathematics. And that was the start of mathematical physics. It was premised on this radical philosophical worldview that took consciousness outside of the domain of science. Now, that project has gone really well, but it was only ever intended as a limited project, putting consciousness on one side, going for what you can capture in mathematics. So, the fact that physical science has gone so well since we took consciousness out doesn't, I think, give us grounds to think, oh, it's going to be the same once we bring consciousness back in. And ultimately, I think, sorry, getting a bit long-winded, but there's a big discussion here. But ultimately, I think what physical science works well at, what it's all about really, is accounting for publicly observable behavior, right? Whether it's a complex living system, explaining it in terms of simpler mechanisms, ultimately postulating basic laws of physics that explain those more complicated forms of behavior. This is what the project is. This is what it's been so good at. This is what's given us incredible technologies, explaining publicly observable behavior. But that's just not what we're trying to do when we're trying to explain consciousness. We're not trying to explain some publicly observable behavior. We're trying to explain this inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes. It's just a totally different explanatory project. And, there are a lot of steps to the argument, but I think it just doesn't make sense we can't sort of capture these subjective qualities, what it's like to see red, what it's like to taste coffee, in the purely quantitative language of physical science. That's not what it's ever been aimed at, and it's not coherent to apply. It's like saying, telescopes have been really good in astronomy. Maybe they'll be good in pure math. It's just a totally different explanatory project. So I think there's just a sort of deep confusion at the root here. But obviously it's a big debate. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that was absolutely terrific. And there's one last thing I want to ask about in this same vein, and I think you've just kind of touched on it. But one common refrain I've heard from the physicalist, I think I've probably heard this from Sean Carroll, which is that if you're saying that science can't account for consciousness in the way that we want it to, does this would mean that our best theories of physics, like quantum field theory, are wrong and need to be revised? But my guess, and then the physicalist like Sean Carroll would say, but quantum field theory is so successful, there is really nothing to revise here. And my guess is your response would be, right, there's nothing to revise here. The science is great. It can be confirmed to 14 decimal points, but it's just not in the business of explaining consciousness, which is why we need something outside of the physicalist paradigm to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect.
And yeah, I mean, people could watch the debate I had with him to go back and forth on this, but I think, one of the advantages of the panpsychist position I defend, one of the reasons it's come to be a still minority, but a position to take very seriously, is that, at least in certain forms, it aspires to not interfere with the physics, just leave the physics as it is, just offer a deeper layer of explanation underneath the physics, right? So we're not adding new forces and so on. There are other forms of panpsychism that do have implications for the physics, and I've also debated that a little bit with Sean. I think, as Sean agrees, the experiments on which we base our current understanding of physics generally involve very small numbers of particles, particle colliders and so on. So it's not like we've tested whether these same equations exactly apply in living systems like brains. We just have no capacity to do that. Now, Sean presses, well, we may have some theoretical reasons to think that these same equations are going to apply at higher levels. Still, I think it's important to distinguish those kind of theoretical considerations with, like, observing in the brain and seeing whether those equations are kept to. Sean agrees with me that we haven't done that. So insofar as we're thinking of more abstract theoretical reasons in physics, we might have to balance that against abstract philosophical reasons and, weigh those things up. I don't think I'm saying anything Sean would disagree with at that point. But anyway, the basic panpsychist position does not necessarily involve fiddling with the physics at all, which is seen as a big advantage of it.